Alrighty, folks, stacked show for you here today. New polls show Democrats in serious trouble. Americans just do not like them. We discuss also the young people. Is everything copacetic with them? Because there's some new poll data on the youngsters. It's not amazing. Plus all your Epstein updates, Gaza updates, everything else. First, there are 36 days until my new book, Lions and Scavengers, hits shelves September 2nd. It's the most important book I've ever written. It's easily the most passionate. I break down the fight for Western civilization between the lions who build civilization and the scavengers who tear it down in the name of grievance, envy, and power. It's the product of 4 years of work. I can't wait for you to read it. If you care about truth, merit, and all the things at stake, go to dailywire.com/Ben and pre-order today. You'll see all the options there. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, even a signed copy from the Daily Wire shop. Pre-order your copy today at dailywire.com/Ben. Well, folks, if you pay attention to the legacy media, President Trump is in serious trouble. The only things happening in the world are the Epstein case and what's going on in the Gaza Strip and all the rest. And we'll get to those topics in just a little while on the show. But here's the thing. Because the legacy media are aligned with the Democratic Party, they would like you to ignore the fact that the Democratic Party has literally never been less popular. And some of that has to do with the maintained popularity of President Trump. If President Trump were wildly unpopular, then the way that politics goes, it's a seesaw. If Trump goes down, Democrats go up. And so if Democrats are down, that means by necessity, President Trump remains up. And the Democrats continue to be unbelievably weak. According to Politico, President Trump's approval rating remains underwater, but Democrats are faring much worse, according to a new poll from the Wall Street Journal released on Saturday. That new survey, conducted by Democratic pollster John Anzalone and Republican pollster Tony Fabrizio, found Democrats' popularity at its lowest point in 3 decades, in 30 years of polling for the Wall Street Journal, with 63% of voters holding an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party. Just 33% of voters hold a favorable view of Democrats. A meager 8% hold a very favorable opinion of Democrats. That means net negative favorability, 30 percentage points. So whatever the media keep telling you about the unpopularity of Trump, Democrats remain way more unpopular. Now, that doesn't mean that President Trump isn't facing stiff headwinds, some of his own making. By 17 points, voters disapprove, for example, of President Trump's handling of tariffs. But they still trust Republicans on trade more than Democrats by 7 points. So here's the problem for the Democrats. People may not like certain aspects of what President Trump is doing, but they do trust that Trump is going to be responsive to reality in a way that Democrats simply are not. There are literally 2 policy issues where Democrats are favored over Republicans. 2. One is healthcare and the other is vaccine policy. Okay, the president right now is negative 7 points. The GOP is negative 11. But remember, the Democrats are negative 30. Negative 30. Now, Democrat enthusiasm, because we're going into a midterm election next year, is higher than Republican enthusiasm. However, despite those poll numbers, Republicans are only down to Democrats in the generic congressional ballot by 3 points, which is basically a toss-up when that translates to individual congressional races. At this time in 2017, Democrats had an 8-point advantage already in the midterm elections. So Democrats are in serious trouble. And the reason is because they are totally and completely out of touch. There's a fascinating piece from the New York Times titled "Inside the Rise of the Multiracial Right," written by Daniel Martinez-Hosang, a professor of American Studies and Political Science at Yale. And the whole piece is about the rightward drift of minority voters, about the fact that President Trump won a radically outsized share of minority voters, despite the fact that we have been told since basically 2008 that the Democratic Party was going to forge a brand new majority-minority coalition that left white voters in the dust. And actually, as it turns out, President Trump wins white voters, but he's also winning an outsized share of Latinos, blacks, Asian Americans. The question is why? And the answer is because the Democratic Party, as it took over all of America's institutions, disconnected itself from normal Americans. The Democratic Party made a couple of major mistakes. One of those is that it decided to implement an elite Ivy League agenda in terms of values at these institutions. That the only thing that mattered in the end was the most radical social values you could possibly imagine. Anti-church values, anti-family values. Yes, it turns out that the radical LGBTQ plus minus divided by sign wing of the Democratic Party alienated an awful lot of minorities, many of whom are still very much ensconced in church and family. And it turns out that if the price of moving along with the Democrats is that you have to believe boys can become girls, that is a major issue for a huge number of Americans. And yet Democrats seem preternaturally obsessed with that issue, unable to abandon that issue. And yes, that is a major obstacle for them. But there's another problem too. And that is that Democrats, because in the end, the elite of the Democratic Party remain upper crust white liberals and fellow travelers like Barack Obama, who again made common cause with those upper crust elite white liberals and felt very safe and comfortable in those particular circles. He talks about this in Dreams from My Father. Because of that, there was a tendency to believe that all minorities felt the same way. There's a flattening of all minority racial groups into one giant blob, quote unquote, people of color. And that's not the way anyone thinks of themselves. Nobody thinks of themselves that way. Hell, white voters don't even think of themselves that way. If you ask a normal white voter, that white voter could be of Polish extraction, of Italian extraction now, of Jewish extraction, of German extraction, of Irish extraction. And there's been an attempt in America to sort of flatten all of these distinctions out, but those distinctions are very real in terms of how people see themselves in terms of identity. So when you tell an Asian American that their interests are identical to those of a Black American or a Black American, that his interests are identical to those of a Latino American, well, in some cases, the answer is yes, because we're all individuals. But in some cases, the answer is very much no. It may turn out, for example, that affirmative action policies that are designed to increase the number of applicants who are Black who get into Ivy League colleges may cut directly against the interests of, say, Asian Americans who are outscoring their competitors on college tests. And so pretending that essentially the coalition of minority groups, they all agree on everything because they're all, quote unquote, people of color in opposition to white people, that is not a winning argument. This is the point of this piece. At the very end, Ho-Sang writes, he's writing about a woman named Deja Davis who attended America Fest, which is a Charlie Kirk Turning Point USA conference. He says, at America Fest, weeks before Mr. Trump began his second term, I met a 25-year-old Black Blexit member named Deja Davis. Blexit is a movement originally started by Candace Owens to get Black Americans to leave the Democratic Party. Committed and idealistic, she projected a strong sense of racial identity and pride. She told me she and the other Black conservatives she works with care so deeply about our community. They were setting up chapters of conservative groups at historically Black colleges and hosting community events. I believe the Black community can do anything, she told me. When I began this work, says Ho-Sang, it was difficult to imagine people of color, again, people of color, like Miss Davis, whose racial identity feels to her in no way out of line with her political one, becoming a major conservative political force in our country. Yet with thousands of voters like her at the Turning Point Conference, that's exactly where we are. For people like Miss Davis, optimism and hope for the future come from the right, not the left. Their racial identity is still at the core of their political beliefs, if anything. So much of what these voters have told me comes from a pointed concern for their communities. But their political decisions are driven more by the realities that racial communities face, collapsing social structures, economic uncertainties, and a sense that the status quo is untenable. So those institutions the Democrats took over and then used the legitimacy of those institutions to promulgate far leftism, it turns out people just lost trust in those institutions and have turned to a wrecking ball like President Trump. Says Ho-Sang, quote, absent a solution to these core problems, appealing to disaffected voters of color on their racial identity alone has rung hollow. Grappling with the complexities of their frustrations, anxieties, and hopes will determine the next political chapter of this country. All of which is, again, quite hopeful for Republicans, for sure. And some of this has to do, again, with the anti-institutional nature of President Trump. Chris Matthews used to be on MSNBC, comes back on, talking about Donald Trump. Says Donald Trump is shockingly popular because he's actually quite a good politician.
He's very good at knowing your condition, your worries, your insecurities. I mean, he'd be a great bully on a grade school, Catholic high school or grade school. I mean, he'd be the scariest bully because he'd know everybody's weakness. But he's really good at the moment. I mean, he's out there watching television and keeping up. And is this the right thing to do? What am I going to do right now? Biden couldn't do that in a million years. Not in a million years. Mondale couldn't do that. They don't have the connection to the electricity of what's going on in the country culturally. And he knows what works.
Not only does he know what works, President Trump has been the point of the spear in one of the things that Americans hate most, which is this belief that if you say something outside of the preserves, the sort of the Hillary Clinton left, you ought to be canceled. One of the effects of this has been a massive backlash. And President Trump is both a symptom and a cause of this backlash against political correctness, wokeness, and cancel culture. Now, I ought to define cancel culture here. Not everybody being criticized is cancel culture. Cancellation is when you lose a job or when you are removed from a platform, not for an opinion like you're pro-Nazi or something, from a platform or a job because you're outside the Overton window. The problem for the left is that the left decreased the so-called Overton window, the window of acceptable discourse, so narrow that virtually everybody ended up being in danger of cancellation. And President Trump fought back against that. He has wildly blown open the Overton window to mostly good effect, but some negative effect, which we'll get to in a minute. Well, one of the effects of that, of the ending of that Overton window dominance by the left, is that organizations that used to be quite powerful, like Media Matters, are now on the ropes. Already coming up, Media Matters may be going bankrupt. Oh man, so delicious, so wonderful. But there are some things in life that are less delicious. Like, for example, your cell phone bill. Like, that is not great because you are paying too much for your cell phone bill. It is just that simple. You know who can help you with that? My friends over at Pure Talk. Over at Pure Talk, they're ensuring that not only are you not paying too much for your cell phone coverage, but you actually have a cell phone that works. Because here's the thing. If you've got an old cell phone, over time, the battery life fades, the processor can't keep up. Maybe you dropped it in the toilet. Did you? Gross. Fortunately, thanks to Pure Talk, your cell phone is something that you can replace without feeling guilty. When you switch to Pure Talk this month, they're going to give you a Samsung Galaxy A36 for free with a $35 qualifying plan. Just $35 a month for talk, text, data, and a free Samsung phone with scratch-resistant Gorilla Glass and a battery that lasts all day long. All on America's most dependable 5G network. We use it here at the office for business. We use it for our calls. We take our business pretty seriously. So if we're using it, it's certainly good enough for you as well. Look, supporting companies like Pure Talk, that's a good thing. You're going to win by cutting your cell phone bill in half. They're going to hire more Americans and help more veterans. Make the switch in as little as 10 minutes. Go to puretalk.com/Shapiro. Get your free phone today. Again, that's puretalk.com/Shapiro and switch to my wireless company, America's wireless company, Pure Talk. Also, if you're a homeowner, you need to listen to this. In today's AI and cyber world, scammers are stealing home titles and your equity is the target. Here's how it works. Criminals forge your signature on one document. They use a fake notary stamp. They pay a small fee with your county, and just like that, your home title is now transferred out of your name. Then they take out loans using your equity or even sell your property, and you won't even know that it's happened until you get a collection or a foreclosure notice. So when is the last time you actually checked on your home title? Well, if your answer is like most people, never, you probably should do that right now. And that's why I've partnered with Home Title Lock, so you can find out today if you're already a victim. A lot of people at the Daily Wire, including people on this team, trust Home Title Lock to protect what is likely one of their biggest assets. Again, much of your value, just as a person with assets, is in the chief asset you own, which is your home. Why would you make that vulnerable? Use my promo code BEN. HometitleLock.com. You'll get a free title history report and a free trial of their $1 million triple lock protection. That's 24/7 monitoring of your title, urgent alerts to any changes, and if fraud does happen, they'll spend up to $1 million to fix it. Don't be a victim. Protect your equity today. Go to HometitleLock.com. Use promo code BEN. That's HometitleLock.com, promo code BEN. So Media Matters is a left-wing organization originally funded by Hillary Clinton acolytes in order to go after right-wing media companies. And what they would do is astroturf boycotts against people like Rush Limbaugh. So Rush Limbaugh would say something, Media Matters would get on the horn to its activists. Those activists would call up Rush Limbaugh's advertisers. Those advertisers, out of fear, would cancel on Rush Limbaugh. Rush would lose millions of dollars. Media Matters would declare victory. Media Matters, for a while in this country, was so powerful that I personally, along with Jeremy Boring, before we co-founded DailyWire, we actually had an organization called Truth Revolt in order to fight back against Media Matters. And we said openly, we're going to go after left-wing media and use the exact same tactics as Media Matters. Not because we like those tactics, but because mutually assured destruction. The minute Media Matters stops doing it, we will stop doing it. And it turns out those tactics were in fact applicable against the left. We went after, for example, Alec Baldwin's advertisers when he was on MSNBC, and Martin Bashir's advertisers when he was on MSNBC, and Al Sharpton at the time. Okay, well now Media Matters, because we now live in the post-Overton window era, Media Matters is basically dead in the water. Fascinating article from the New York Times by Kenneth Vogel, Kate Conger, and Ryan Mack. Quote, Media Matters, a nonprofit group that has played a key role in liberal politics, is struggling to withstand months of legal assaults by President Trump's allies, offering a glimpse of what might be in store for even well-funded targets of his retribution campaigns. But it's not just about President Trump. The fact is, people don't want to give to organizations that are specifically dedicated at canceling mainstream public opinions. The organization, which is funded by some of the Democratic Party's biggest donors, has racked up $15 million in legal fees over the past 20 months to defend itself against lawsuits by Elon Musk, in addition to investigations by Mr. Trump's Federal Trade Commission and Republican state attorneys general. And again, many of those investigations are warranted considering the sort of collusive impact of Media Matters. The group has now slashed the size of its staff and scrambled to raise more cash from skittish donors, according to documents and interviews with 11 people familiar with the organization's fight to survive. That might not be enough. Media Matters tried to settle with Mr. Musk by offering concessions, but the sides were far apart and talks fizzled. Apparently, it has considered shutting, which would be very good for the country. Angelo Corazon, the president of Media Matters, said, quote, unlike some major media entities that have recently caved to pressure, we understand this battle is larger than us. That's why we continue to carry out our mission and fight in court. But again, this is a dramatic downturn for Media Matters because they were part of that censorious left that basically said anything outside of the purview of the Democratic Party was unacceptable discourse. Media Matters has originally funded by David Brock, who switched sides, became a left-wing radical enforcer for the Democratic Party. That was clearly what they were about. Media Matters is made up of two separate nonprofits registered under sections of the tax code, one for charities and the other for social welfare groups. Some major donors include people like George Soros, as well as Stephen F. Mandel Jr., a hedge fund manager, Susie Tompkins Buell, clothing entrepreneur. So again, they are in serious trouble, and it couldn't happen to a group of nicer people. Seriously could not happen to a group of nicer people. In May, the FTC launched an investigation into whether Media Matters and roughly a dozen other watchdog and advertising groups illegally colluded to dissuade companies from buying ads on X, among other platforms. Again, this is a cause that DailyWire has been leading literally since the first day that we started getting involved in this particular cause. Like since launch, this has been one of our chief causes. So the era of the censorious left, the upper crust Harvard liberal who speaks down and patronizes to minorities and then shuts the Overton window so nobody can speak different. That day is ending. And Democrats don't know what to do about it. They're quite puzzled about what is the next step here. It seems that they just want to rage against the machine. Jonathan Capehart of the Washington Post, he says the Democrats have to stand up and fight, but he's not providing a real playbook here.
Well, I think Democratic Party faithful, they know that their leaders are in the minority, that there's not much that they can do. But you're just going to sit there and just let this happen? We need you to stand up and fight. Give voice to the fear and the anger and the frustration that's out there in the country, not just among Democrats, but just Americans who see this chipping away at democracy that they don't like. So you have to fight and don't worry about ticking someone off or hurting a certain constituency. In the end, it's about saving the country, saving our democracy, and then you can, put the pieces back together later.
Yeah, good luck. Good luck with that. I love that David Brooks is sitting next to him on PBS NewsHour, and this is just indicative of what the Democratic Party is. Upper crust, highly paid media members of all races who agree with each other that the number one priority in America is saving people like them. Here's David Brooks saying universities have to stand up and fight Trump.
The other option, which I thought we were going to have, is a broad coalition, not only of all universities, but all law firms, businesses, nonprofits, foundations, anybody in any sector that could be part of the extortion attempt. And they were band together, there's strength in numbers. If they come for one of us, they come for all of us, sort of a domestic NATO, Article 5.
Yeah, good luck. They come for one of us, they come for... If your party is Jonathan Capehart and David Brooks, you are in serious, serious trouble. And so the Democratic Party is now turning to younger cadres. But the problem is that all the young socialists are also people who are spoiled brats. Okay, typically, they are spoiled brats. The best example being this amazing article from the New York Post. Apparently, socialist New York City mayoral frontrunner Zoran Mamdani celebrated his recent nuptials with a lavish 3-day affair at his family's ritzy, secluded Ugandan compound, complete with masked security guards and a cell phone jamming system, according to the New York Post. The gates of the bustling private compound, which sits in the wealthy Buziga Hill area outside the capital city of Kampala, were heavily guarded by military-style masked men this week, with guests streaming in and partying until midnight, according to sources in the town who wished to remain anonymous for security reasons. Mamdani had eloped with artist and animator Rama Duaji, 27, in February. He told his social media followers Sunday he was headed to his homeland to celebrate with his wealthy filmmaker mom and professor dad, who own that Buziga Hill property. Apparently, the neighborhood is home to some of Uganda's richest, including billionaire businessman Godfrey Kirumira, a city tycoon with stakes in real estate, tourism, petroleum, and infrastructure, and houses the neighboring Mamdani's easily fetch more than $1 million, which in Uganda, by the way, is like a lot of money. A $1 million home in the United States, can be like a mid-sized home depending on where you are. It could be a huge home depending where you are. In Uganda, I promise you, that's going to be a really, really nice house because the GDP per capita in Uganda is precisely $1,000 per capita. So $1 million will buy you half the country. I love you want to talk about limousine socialists? That is what you're looking at right now. Okay, so the Democratic Party is on the ropes. They are on the ropes, but there is an increasing danger. And that danger comes in the form of a splintering that is happening on the right. So part of the problem with the destruction of the institutions by the left is that there are, in fact, no replacements for the institutions. So there has been a split on the right between what Alana Newhouse, a tablet, has called the brokenness, people who believe the institutions need to be completely torn down, ripped to the ground, new institutions built, and people who believe the institutions are fixable. The area where the right generally agreed, however, is that institutions are necessary. One of the problems with the death of the legacy media, and believe me, I'm a big fan of the death of the legacy media since we run a major media company here at DailyWire. And one of the things that's happened is that with distrust in institutions, justified, earned distrust in the institutions, that has been replaced by a variety of sources, some which are good and some which are bad. And unless people are trained in how to actually distinguish good sources from bad sources, they tend to intake an enormous amount of trash. And that's what's happened with younger Americans. So while I am quite optimistic about the future of the Republican Party, I am quite pessimistic about the nature of the quote-unquote younger generation. There's a very interesting article by a guy named John Puri over at National Review. He's a summer editorial intern at National Review. He's a young guy himself. He studies politics and history at Stanford. And he goes through some of the poll numbers about Gen Z. He says, there's an odd thing that many older liberals tend to say about America's youth. As a member of Generation Z, which currently comprises those aged 13 to 28, I've often heard a similar refrain. It's you young people who are going to save this country. Some older liberals say such things because they seem to truly believe that young Americans are an especially enlightened demographic, that we, purely by dint of our youth, have a better understanding of the world than does everyone else. Sometimes this assumption is translated into policy. He points out the UK saying that 16-year-olds should vote. However, he says, one small problem, Gen Z does not have some superior moral authority. We do not understand the world better than everyone else. Our political beliefs are not especially enlightened. Quite the opposite, in fact. The polling data reflect that we are largely morally and factually bankrupt. So, for example, he cites the moral perception of the recent war between Israel and Hamas. Apparently, according to an April 2024 Pew Research poll, Americans were asked whether Hamas's reasons for fighting Israel were valid. An overwhelming majority of Americans said no. But for those aged 18 to 29, 34% said Hamas's reasons were valid compared to 30% who thought otherwise. That age group was also the most likely to say that the way Hamas carried out its attack against Israel on October 7th, a giant terror attack, the worst attack on Jews since World War II, they said 9% said that it was valid, double the number of any other age group. A Harvard-Harris field survey after October 7th found similar results. Those 18 to 24 concluded by a majority, 51 to 49, that Hamas's massacre, quote, can be justified by the grievances of Palestinians. And it's not just that. When it comes to, for example, the killing of Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare, a poll of college students, Axios reported in January, found that half view the suspect extremely or somewhat favorably. Asked with whom they sympathized more, Mangione, the killer, or Brian Thompson, the victim, 45% said Mangione, 17% said Thompson. Nearly a quarter of Americans aged 18 to 24 say they trust Russian President Vladimir Putin over Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. That is the highest number by far in the age group. 52% of U.S. college students say it may be acceptable to block other students from attending a speech on campus. 68% approve of shouting down a speaker they disagree with. 32% say using violence is appropriate. Apparently, The Economist did a poll last year, and it found that 1 in 5 Americans aged 18 to 29 believe the Holocaust is a myth, and another 30% say they do not know whether the Holocaust is a myth, meaning like half of young Americans 18 to 29 either don't know whether the Holocaust is a myth or believe it is a myth. 28% said Jews wield too much power in America. Now, the question is, where is all this coming from? And the answer is, a lot of this is coming from crap social media accounts. It's coming from TikTok. It's coming from X. A huge amount of news that is intaken by young people is not coming from anything that looks like a vetted source or a source that actually cares about reality or veracity. In fact, 63% of Generation Z, quote, does not believe in moral absolutes, but thinks what is morally right or wrong depends on what an individual believes. So what is right changes over time based on society. Only 34% of Generation Z believe lying is morally wrong, which is lower than any other generation. Now, why do I point this out? Because if you want to know why conspiratorialism has soared, again, there are good reasons to distrust all these institutions. It is a good thing that people look at institutions hollowed out by the left wing with radical skepticism and look to build new institutions or restore those institutions by kicking the left out of those institutions and actually regaining credibility. However, if the substitute for this is an atomized society in which you go to TikTok for your information or X.com for your information, you're going to end up with some pretty bad information. And this is why conspiratorialism has soared on every side of the political aisle. And that is dangerous because conspiratorial nonsense, again, there are conspiracies. We've talked about many of them. Russiagate was an actual conspiracy. The media attempting to shut down the Hunter Biden laptop story, actual conspiracy. Like these are things that actually happened in real life. The thing about conspiracies that are real, as I've said 1,000 times on the show, is there is evidence of them. You can name the people involved. Conspiratorial thinking, however, speculates that there is an unnamed group of people who you can't put a finger on, but you know they're there, and behind closed doors, they must be doing something nefarious and terrible, and therefore you are not in control of your own life, and you get to be very angry at someone. Right? That sort of thinking is not good for society. It's not good politically. It's not good at all. It is bad for you as a human to engage in that sort of thinking because it means that you are essentially saying that you are not in control of your own future. You're not in control of your own life, and there's no prospect that you will be because the shadowy forces control everything. Alrighty, coming up, all your Epstein updates. The story that, unlike Jeffrey Epstein, apparently won't die. First, have you ever wondered why elite athletes, business moguls, and high performers are using Armra colostrum? Well, it's because Armra colostrum packs over 400 natural nutrients that work at the cellular level to build muscle, speed recovery, and boost performance. No artificial stuff, just pure fuel for whatever you are tackling. Think of it as your body's natural defense system upgrade. It strengthens your immune barriers throughout your entire body while supporting your gut wall system for better digestion, less bloating. Plus, it helps your body absorb nutrients more effectively and keeps your metabolism running smoothly. You'll also notice the difference in your skin's radiance thanks to natural antioxidants and collagen-boosting compounds. Plus, there's a reason elite athletes have been using colostrum for years. It enhances endurance and speeds up recovery so you can bounce back faster. The bottom line, Armra colostrum gives your body comprehensive support to thrive naturally. We worked out a special offer for my audience. Receive 30% off your first subscription order. Go to armra.com/Shapiro or enter Shapiro. Get 30% off your first subscription order. That's armra.com/Shapiro. Again, armra.com/Shapiro or enter Shapiro to get 30% off your first subscription order. Also, as we celebrated Independence Day earlier this July, we're reminded of the freedoms our founders fought to protect, like, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Here's something that might surprise you. There's still Americans today whose most basic right, the right to life itself, is indeed at risk. And that's where Preborn comes in. They're doing amazing work through their network of clinics offering free ultrasounds to women facing unplanned pregnancies. Here's what's amazing. These ultrasounds don't just provide medical care, they're actually saving lives. When a mom sees her baby on that screen, hears the heartbeat, everything changes. But Preborn isn't just about the baby. They truly care for these women as well. They provide love, support, and resources during what can be an incredibly difficult time. Look, if we really believe what our Constitution says, that all people are created equal with unalienable rights, that has to include the smallest and most vulnerable among us. These babies deserve the same rights our founders declared: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. You can be part of this mission for just $28. That's the cost of one life-saving ultrasound. Or you can sponsor 5 ultrasounds for $140. To donate, just dial pound 250 and say baby. That's pound 250 baby, or visit preborn.com/Ben. That's preborn.com/Ben. And so much of this is now being projected into what is going on the Jeffrey Epstein score. Now, again, I will say it for the 1,000th time. People have a right to be angry about how the Jeffrey Epstein story was handled. Everyone believed, based on sort of the gestalt of the story, for literally a decade, people believed that Jeffrey Epstein was engaged in taping of and blackmail of very, very prominent figures by sex trafficking minors to them. That was the story. Okay, that's what everybody thought the story was. And that story was fomented by a lot of people in media who sort of picked up on a hint there or a clue there and put it all together and wrapped it up in a ball and then promoted the idea that certainly when we got access to the files, there would be something there. And that included the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. I mean, it did. It included Kash Patel at the FBI. It included a lot of people who were speculating. And again, speculating in the absence of evidence, I'm not anti that. If you want to ask questions in the absence of evidence, of course, you should. Skepticism is warranted. Once the evidence is made available, or once people you trust, the people who are asking those same questions, get access to the evidence, and they say, we looked, we tried, and we found there wasn't as much there, there wasn't what we thought was there. Once that happens, if you are still maintaining that same position, you have to call those people liars or complicit in all of this. And this is why President Trump is so annoyed. Because President Trump is like, listen, President Trump has humored pretty much all of the just asking questions that it's possible to humor in American life. President Trump is not somebody who has quashed conspiracy theorizing. President Trump is very much in favor of investigating all of those things. And yet President Trump is now being told that because his DOJ and FBI went through the evidence and came to a conclusion different than they thought they would come to, he now must be complicit, and now he has to answer all these Epstein questions. And so he's annoyed. And again, a lot of this is being fomented by those disparate sources of information and left-wing media. So there is a horseshoe that's happening right now. You have people inside the Republican Party, who I've termed pseudo-MAGA, who are attempting to wrest control of the MAGA movement away from President Trump by claiming that he is in fact a corrupt figurehead who is covering up a child sex rape ring. And then you have people on the left who are perfectly willing to say the same thing because they want MAGA to die. And they are joining hands right now. So here's President Trump yesterday being asked about Epstein, and he's obviously annoyed.
Mr. President, was part of the rush to get this deal done to knock the Jeffrey Epstein story out?
Oh, you got to be kidding with that. No, had nothing to do with it. Only you would think that. That had nothing to do with it.
And there's been an attempt by the administration, by Speaker Johnson, by everybody else, to basically say, fine, transparency, let's try to get as much information as we can. This has refocused the administration away from important things that are happening, which we'll actually get to in a moment, and onto things like, let's go interview Ghislaine Maxwell, who is Jeffrey Epstein's paramour, complicit, sex trafficker, sentenced to 20 years in prison for sex trafficking young girls for the pleasure of her boyfriend and of herself, apparently. Well, on Thursday and Friday, according to the New York Times, Justice Department officials interviewed Maxwell, who's currently serving that 20-year sentence. Her lawyers said she answered questions about a host of people, but it was unclear what information she provided. Todd Blanche, the deputy AG who brokered the meeting, said on Thursday the department will share additional information about what we learned at the appropriate time. She's obviously gaming for a pardon. Right? What she's now attempting to do is say, I know a bunch of people who are not President Trump, who are other people, and I'm going to spill the beans on them. All you have to do is pardon me. Well, Speaker Johnson correctly says, listen, she is a sex criminal and a pervert and a pedophile. She should have a life sentence, not a 20-year sentence.
If you're asking my opinion, I think 20 years was a pittance. I think she should have a life sentence at least. I mean, think of all these unspeakable crimes. And as you noted earlier, probably 1,000 victims. I mean, it's hard to put into words how evil this was, and that she orchestrated it and was a big part of it. At least under the criminal sanction, I think is an unforgivable thing.
And again, there are a bunch of people inside the Republican Party who are saying that she's sort of the key to the whole thing. You're seeing a lot of right-wing influencers saying she's the key to the whole thing. The big problem here is that you do have the possibility that, the convicted sex trafficker, pervert, and liar, that she might be lying about some of this stuff. And so you actually need extraneous evidence in order to prove her allegations, because that's just the way the system works and ought to work. Speaker Johnson says, I certainly hope she's telling the truth, but she has some ulterior motives.
Well, I mean, look, it's a good question. I hope so. I hope that she would want to come clean. We certainly are interested in knowing everything that she knows. And as you'll note, in our House Republican majority, we're working towards that. Chairman Comer and our Oversight Committee has already issued their own subpoena. They want to bring in Ghislaine Maxwell as well. I hope she's telling the truth. She is convicted. She is serving a 20-year sentence for child sex trafficking. And so her character is in some question. But if she wants to come clean now, that would be a great service to the country. And we'd like to know every single bit of information that she has. I certainly hope she's telling the truth.
Well, and again, listen, as much transparency as legally possible would be excellent here. As much verified information and credible information as legally possible should be released. I mean, this is obviously a matter of significant public interest and has been for, as I say, years and years and years and years at this point. Okay, with that said, there is a politically motivated attempt to damage President Trump. It's coming from both the right and the left, and pretending it's not there is just being silly. Obviously, it's there. It is there from a right that disagrees with President Trump on policy and is seeking to undermine his credibility and what he is doing right now in order to wrest control of the Republican Party away from him and leave unscathed other people around him, other members of the administration, for example. Thomas Massie continues to accuse the GOP leadership of hiding something in the Epstein files. Does he really believe that? What does he think is being hidden? I'd love to hear him theorize. What is the thing that he says is being hidden? What is it? Trump personally? Who's doing it? Is it Kash Patel? Is it Dan Bongino? Is it Pam Bondi? Who's doing it? Here was Thomas Massie, who's been, again, joining hands with Ro Khanna, the radical left congressperson from California, to suggest that the administration is engaged in a cover-up.
What is your response to the concern that releasing these files could ultimately hurt the victims, Congressman Massie?
Well, look, that's a straw man. Roe and I carefully crafted this legislation so that the victims' names will be redacted and that no child pornography will be released. So they're hiding behind that. We're trying to get justice for the victims and transparency for America. And so, we've redacted things before. We don't want to hurt the victims. We're doing this for the victims. I think it's just something that they're hiding behind.
And again, Massey, who is they? Who is they? Who's the they who's doing the hiding? Meanwhile, the Democrats are joining hands with Thomas Massey. Democratic Representative Mark Vesey of Texas says that President Trump is hiding something.
Oh, Donald Trump is obviously trying to hide something. That's why he's acting so guilty over this. And the other thing that's really disturbing about that is that Maxwell was interviewed outside of prison. There was no reason why she needed to be transported away from a federal lockup when he just could have gone there and met with her and her attorney. And so, yeah, I think that something is really shady here. And just everything around the whole Epstein file since Trump has found out that he's been in the files in May has just been 100% shady.
When Republicans find themselves hugging Ro Khanna and Vesey, then you might want to think what the motivation is. Why is that happening? What is the thing that is happening there? And here's the thing. There are actual real conspiracies. Again, conspiracies exist. The question is, do you have evidence for those conspiracies? So over the weekend, Dan Bongino, who's the deputy director of the FBI, put out a statement, quote, "Based on my tenure here as the deputy director of the FBI, I've repeatedly relayed to you things that are happening that might not be immediately visible, but they are happening. The director and I are committed to stamping out public corruption and the political weaponization of both law enforcement and intelligence operations. It is a priority for us, but what I have learned in the course of our properly predicated and necessary investigations into these aforementioned matters has shocked me down to my core. We cannot run a republic like this. I'll never be the same after learning what I've learned. We are going to conduct these righteous and proper investigations by the book and in accordance with the law. We are going to get to the answers we deserve. As with any investigation, I cannot predict where it will land, but I can promise you an honest and dignified effort at truth, not my truth or your truth, but the truth. God bless America and all those who defend her. Respectfully, Dan." And what is he talking about right there? Well, I assume what he's talking about is more Russiagate information, more of the intelligence community manufacturing of information surrounding the supposed collusion between Trump and Russia, or Russia wanting Trump to be president. CIA Director John Ratcliffe was on Fox with Maria Bartiromo, and he says there will be an annex to the so-called Durham report, which looked into all of this, coming very soon.
What hasn't come out yet, and what's going to come out, is the underlying intelligence that I have spent the last few months making recommendations about final declassification and sent that to the Department of Justice, that will come out in the John Durham report classified annex. And what that intelligence shows, Maria, is that part of this was a Hillary Clinton plan, but part of it was an FBI plan to be an accelerant to that fake Steele dossier, to those fake Russia collusion claims, by pouring oil on the fire, by amplifying the lie and burying the truth of what Hillary Clinton was up to.
Now, again, while all of this is going on, President Trump is still winning actual victories, which is why his approval rating remains extremely steady, despite all of the conspiracies, actual and conspiracies that, again, are being ramped up by actors who do not like President Trump and are antipathetic to his actual agenda. And meanwhile, there are victories being won by the Trump administration on trade. So President Trump, as we say, has been using tariff threats as leverage. Howard Lutnick on Sunday, he said on Fox News Sunday, August 1st is when the tariffs kick in. And in advance of that, people are coming in there making deals, which obviously is true. Here's the Commerce Secretary.
Okay, so no extensions, no more grace periods. August 1st, the tariffs are set. They'll go into place. Customs will start collecting the money, and off we go. Obviously, after August 1st, people can still talk to President Trump. I mean, he's always willing to listen. And between now and then, I think the president's going to talk to a lot of people. Whether they can make him happy is another question, but the president's definitely willing to negotiate and talk.
Well, President Trump over the weekend reached a deal with the EU. There's a lot of worry that there would not be a deal with the EU. According to the Wall Street Journal, he said he reached a trade agreement on Sunday with the EU, avoiding a damaging trade war with the United States, his largest trading partner, and marking his biggest deal so far. Apparently, the United States will set a baseline tariff of 15% for European goods, including automobiles. He said the EU had also agreed as part of the deal to buy $750 billion of energy products from the United States and invest an additional $600 billion in the United States. He said, I think it's going to be great for both parties. Here was President Trump announcing that EU trade deal with the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
And with NATO, as you know, they're going up to 5% from 2%. And the relationship is very strong with NATO. So I just want to congratulate you. I think it's great that we made a deal today instead of playing games and maybe not making a deal at all. I think it's, I'm going to let you say, but I think it's the biggest deal ever made. Thank you very much.
Okay, and the EU is at least relieved that it didn't kick up to a 30% tariff. Now, would I prefer that the tariffs be lower? Of course, because again, tariffs are a tax on American consumers. Does this provide a level of at least certainty and stability, given the fact that this is a deal going forward, as opposed to it's going to go up, it's going to go down, it's going to be all around? Yes, and certainty is the thing the economy is looking for right now. Von der Leyen said today's deal creates certainty in uncertain times. The 15% level, she said, is the best we could get. And again, this is not unexpected because President Trump had suggested that there would be sort of a flat rate tariff applied to everybody. But this is an avoidance of something significantly worse. For his part, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he announced the first June budget surplus since 2015.
The U.S. is taking in massive amounts of tariff income. We had the first June budget surplus since 2015, last month. We reported it this month. And so we are taking in substantial income.
Okay, so again, all of this is not bad for President Trump. Much of it is very good for President Trump. And while the media tried to say that President Trump is going to lead to a government shutdown, that's actually not what's going on. So right now, there's a big discussion that's happening over rescission. Rescission is a process whereby Congress can now go and confirm cuts that are being made via DOGE in the executive branch. According to the Washington Post, the Senate took a tentative first step this weekend towards striking a deal to avoid a government shutdown this fall. Republicans in Congress last week approved President Trump's request to cancel $9 billion in foreign aid and funding for public broadcasting, giving the administration a victory in its ongoing battle with lawmakers over the power of the purse. And the White House is going to look for more rescissions. Democrats are going to need to sign on to a continuing resolution to continue to fund the government. And they are threatening that they are not going to sign some sort of continuing resolution if Congress then comes back and by pure majority, without the filibuster in the Senate, can simply rescind funding that the executive branch wants rescinded. Well, there's only one problem with that argument for Democrats. Republicans are saying clean CR. Clean CR. We'll continue to fund the government at current levels. If Democrats say no to that, they're going to have to explain to the American people why they're saying no to that. Why are they saying no to that? In order to preserve more spending on foreign aid, more spending on federal education or something? So the White House has come up with a rather clever strategy here, frankly. And that strategy is we will use rescissions to make cuts, but we will continue on top line to fund the federal government at current levels. The Office of Management and Budget Director, Russ Vought, he says, sure, of course, we're going to continue to look at potential rescission options.
Is that the plan? Are you seeking to claw back education funds in a rescissions package? And if so, when are you sending that up?
We're always looking at potential rescission options. This is a set of funding that we wanted to make sure it got out. We did our programmatic review. We wanted to make sure it got out before the school year, even though it's multi-year funding. This is not funding that would expire at the end of this year. We are looking to do a rescissions package. We're always gauging the extent to which the Congress is willing to participate in that process. And we'll be looking at a lot of different options along those lines.
Okay, so again, this is a smart strategy by President Trump and by his team. And as far as the government shutdown goes, he says, well, actually, listen, we would like to have ACR. We don't want another gigantic omnibus bill.
We are not laying the predicate for a shutdown. We are laying the predicate for the fact that the only thing that has worked in this town, the appropriations process is broken. It leads to omnibus bills. We want to prevent an omnibus bill, and all options are on the table to be able to do that.
So again, smart stuff from President Trump. These are big victories. They are. Rescission is a big victory. The EU signing a trade deal is a big victory for President Trump. Things are actually getting done. Now, as I say, there are a lot of actors out there who have an interest in ensuring that President Trump is unpopular and also are perfectly willing to lie in order to foment that. Now, the biggest liars on planet Earth are, of course, Hamas. So you've seen an enormous amount of coverage of what's going on in the Gaza Strip over the course of the last week. And as it turns out, an enormous amount of that coverage is false. Okay, so what's actually happening in the Gaza Strip? Yes, it turns out that many Gazans cannot get food aid. Why? Because the UN literally refuses to ship food in if they are escorted by the IDF. Because the UN wants to fund Hamas. Hamas is stealing the aid. Hamas then sells the aid to fund itself. The reason the war has not ended is because Hamas has continued access to all of this aid, which they then steal and either resell or use themselves. That is the reason the war has continued. And so what Israel did is, along with the United States, they set up, as we talked about last week, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Johnny Moore, the head of the GHF, joined us on the show last week. The GHF operates to try to weed out members of Hamas from actual Gazan civilians and providing millions of meals, millions of pounds of food into Gaza. And so naturally, Hamas doesn't want the GHF to do that. And the good news for them is they have Democrats who are always willing to do their dirty work. For example, Senator Chris Van Hollen, he comes out, Chris Van Hollen, over the weekend in Maryland, who's awful. And he says that actually the United States should defund the GHF and allow a bunch of organizations that work hand in glove with Hamas to have the aid again.
Today, I'm sending a letter to Secretary Rubio, signed with 20 of my colleagues, calling for more information, but also calling for defunding this. American taxpayers should not be spending one penny to fund this private organization backed by mercenaries and by the IDF that has become a death trap. Over 1,000 people have died from being shot and killed as starving people crowd to try to get food at just these 4 sites.
Okay, so let's be clear. The reason people are being shot and killed is because Hamas is literally firing rockets at GHF. That happened last week. They've been using the crowd as cover to shoot at IDF soldiers, stealing aid. They've been shooting Palestinians themselves who are trying to get aid. And Chris Van Hollen's solution is, what if we continue to allow the United Nations, which we also fund, by the way, the United Nations to continue to push aid to Hamas? The only way the war in Gaza comes to an end is if Hamas is extirpated, if the leadership goes into exile, the hostages are released, and some form of safe zone is actually set up in the Gaza Strip to ensure that Palestinians can get their food aid. The good news for Hamas is always and forever they have the help of the legacy media. I mean, truly have the help of the legacy media. So you may have seen an image that was on the front page of the Daily Express in Great Britain. It was a picture of a Palestinian mother holding a child. And it's a horrifying picture. It's a child who is skeletal, like absolutely skeletal. It was also on the front page of the New York Times, CNN, Sky News, BBC, The Guardian. Okay, so there are a bunch of problems with this particular picture and set of pictures. Okay, so one, here's the biggest problem. This kid, who is clearly suffering, is a medically vulnerable child. And what I mean by that is not that this is a normal kid who's starving. That's not what's actually happening here. In fact, this child, his name is Mohammed al-Matouk. Apparently, there are other images of Mohammed al-Matouk and his mother holding him. Here, for example, is an image that the media chose not to use, according to reporter David Collier. Okay, this is a picture of him being held by his mother. You may notice something in the background. Oh, yes, it's another child, his 3-year-old brother, Jude. His 3-year-old brother, Jude, looks fed and healthy, certainly not skeletal that way. Why? Well, because it turns out that Mohammed has cerebral palsy and hypoxemia and was born with a serious genetic disorder. He has required nutritional supplements since birth. There's a medical report issued in Gaza in May 2025 that confirmed all of that. Not a single major outlet ran that. They pretended that this was like a normal, healthy child who's just suffering from starvation. Now, again, there are starvation problems in Gaza, but this sort of insane media coverage is designed to elicit a feeling that whatever happens, it's Israel's job to make sure that Hamas be damned, that everybody gets aid, even if it means that Hamas extends the war by another 2 years and continues to maintain its control over the Gaza Strip and uses it as a hub for terrorist attacks. You know, again, there are people who are having nutritional problems in Gaza. That's why Israel itself, again, in an unprecedented act of wartime charity, is literally shipping in millions of pounds a day into the Gaza Strip to the very people who are currently holding hostages, Israeli citizens. By the way, the media also said that Mohammed, this kid from this picture, had no father because he'd been killed by the Israelis while out looking for food. The problem is that he was killed in an area where terrorists were attacking Israelis in October of 2024. There's actual video from the area where this was happening last year, where he was supposedly out looking for food. Terrorists were out targeting IDF troops. So again, what this is a propaganda war in which the media are engaged. The UN is engaged in it too, because the UN is basically a tool of Hamas at this point. That wasn't the only intentionally misleading photo that was shown. There's another intentionally misleading photo that was making the rounds. Publication, for example, in Italy called Il Fatto Quotidiano put out a picture of a child, again, skeletal, looking like something out of the Holocaust, saying Gaza horror. There's only one problem. The kid's name is Osama al-Rakab. He has cystic fibrosis, a serious genetic illness, and he's been in Italy receiving treatment since June 12th. Israel enabled his medical transfer from Gaza. Why does all this matter? Because again, the goal here for Hamas is to create an emotional feeling that no matter what, no matter how long the war lasts, no matter how many hostages are held, that Israel has a duty and obligation to ship aid into Hamas using Hamas's preferred aid distribution mechanisms. Now, Israel does and should attempt to facilitate humanitarian aid into Gaza, but only to people who are truly innocent, who are not working for Hamas, who are not stealing the aid and setting up food markets. And this is why it is deeply frustrating when columnists like Ross Douthat write pieces in the New York Times that are utterly and completely misinformed. So Ross Douthat, who's good on a wide variety of issues, here he says, quote, there are tests that Israel is failing. The first one is the hardest to assess because every protracted war yields inevitable civilian suffering, and an urban war against an entrenched enemy especially will have casualties that can't be refined away. Such a war cannot be fought exclusively with precision strikes. The soldiers fighting it cannot be prevented from making terrible mistakes, and war crimes are inevitably committed even in righteous conflicts. So there's no way to look at the rubble in Gaza and the death toll estimates and offer a mathematical proof that Israel is failing to exercise adequate restraint. I just think it's true. Okay, well, I just think it's true is not a standard for literally anything. Evidence is the standard. The statistics that you adamantly say you do not have would be the standard. I just think it's true is not a thing. Ross Douthat would not say the same thing with regard to, for example, police activity in inner cities. I just think it's true doesn't cut it. But it goes on. He says deaths from famine are a clearer matter, which is why the threat of starvation is leading even some of Israel's strongest supporters to warn its government something must be changed. By the way, Israel has been declaring 10-hour breaks in the fighting in order to facilitate the entry of more aid. Israel has been asking Arab governments to airdrop aid into Gaza. The UN is facilitating Hamas, period. Quote, the UN says it cannot accept Israeli offers to secure aid convoys because of its principle of neutrality in armed conflicts. So the UN is refusing to ship in trucks filled with aid because it's afraid that Israel might facilitate its entry to actual Palestinian civilians. Back to Ross Douthat. He says, Israel has made a strategic choice, trying to separate food distribution from a system that it argues Hamas was exploiting for its own purposes. But if your strategic choice leads to children dying of starvation when the food is available to feed them, a civilized nation has to make a different choice, even if that makes things easier for its enemy to some degree. Okay, again, this is utterly principle-free. If this were the case, then the United States would have had an obligation during World War II, when starvation was a real thing in many areas of the globe, to ship in aid at the cost of the death of thousands of American soldiers. That is not how war works at all. That's not how war works. Now, Ross Douthat goes out of his way to then disown America's war fighting of the past, which is really, it must be nice to be able to sit on top of a mountain where wars are fought absolutely antiseptically and then pretend that when the cost isn't yours, you get to just have others bear it. He says, right now, if I were predicting an endgame for the struggle, it would involve Israel finally stepping back in exhaustion, cordoning off the Gaza Strip again, watching bloody power struggles play out in an isolated Gaza, and accepting that some kind of terrorist threat will be harbored there for years to come. If that's the outcome, then fighting on for another year to end up there is an unjust waste of life. Well, so I'm just going to point out that you are calling for them to do it now. That is not Israel's plan. That is not the United States' plan. If you wish for a better future for Palestinians, they cannot live under the tender mercies of Hamas. But basically, Ross Douthat is saying that Israel should essentially back off and let Hamas run the place. Okay, well, great. So that's the plan. I gotta say, the amount of misinformed commentary here and deliberately misleading commentary is truly astonishing. Barack Obama is the best case in point of this. Barack Obama, who is awful on this issue, as he is on virtually all other issues, he says, while a lasting resolution to the crisis in Gaza must involve a return of all hostages and a cessation of Israel's military operations, these articles underscore the immediate need for action to be taken to prevent the travesty of innocent people dying of preventable starvation. So, in other words, Israel should just let its hostages molder in tunnels and hand aid to Hamas, according to Barack Obama. There's a shock. Couldn't have predicted he would be there, except for, of course, he would. Of course he would. President Trump, is actually the only person with a morally clear view of the situation. He says Gaza is a mess. Hamas is stealing the food, which is true.
Well, it's terrible. You know, when I see the children, and when I see, especially over the last couple of weeks, and people are stealing the food, they're stealing the money, they're stealing the money for the food, they're stealing weapons, they're stealing everything. It's a mess. That whole place is a mess.
Hey, he is right about all of that. Speaker Johnson says Israel is trying to ship in the food. Hamas is stealing it, and they've made $500 million by stealing it and reselling it. This is the source of the problem. Israel's solution, and the GHF solution, has been, let's get a supply line in there that only gets it to Palestinian civilians, because that brings an end to the war. And Hamas is fighting back the best way it knows how by creating massive amounts of human misery and suffering, and then blaming Israel for it, hoping the rest of the world will then cave to Hamas's demands. Here's Representative Johnson.
This is important to note. Israel, since this war began, has supplied over 94,000 truckloads full of food. It's enough food to feed 2 million people for 2 years, trying to get that into Gaza. But Hamas has stolen the food, a huge amount. In fact, in 2024, the numbers are that Hamas profited over $500 million in stolen food aid that was supposed to go to these poor people who needed it. That's half of their budget. So this is a broken system.
That is exactly right. That's exactly right. But in order to fix the system, you at least have to acknowledge the problem with the system. And it is incredible to me that if you acknowledge the problem with the system, meaning Hamas stealing the aid, and then your solution is to let Hamas steal the aid, thus to prolong the war and ensure that Hamas remains in control. That's your solution. That is not a solution at all. It's not a solution that should be acceptable to anyone, obviously. And meanwhile, other controversial news. So, apparently, there was something called the Cincinnati Jazz Festival. And the Cincinnati Jazz Festival, of course, was a large agglomeration of jazz musicians and fans. And a fight broke out. We don't know sort of the origins of the fight, but it ended with, again, there's no way to do this without discussing the racial angle to this, with a group of black men beating the living hell out of a white man, curb stomping him, essentially. And then when his girlfriend comes to try and protest, knocking her out. This guy's running away. There are a group of young black males who are attacking him, knocking him to the ground, punching him, kicking him, beating him senseless on the ground. And people just filming it, and you can hear them yelling in joy and exultation. Now, let's just be very clear. If the only thing, we don't know the full circumstances of this assault. We don't know what led to it. We don't know the condition of the people involved. We don't know any of this. So I'm saying that up front. If the suspects' races were reversed, if everybody involved, the races were reversed, we know this would be a national news story for days. It would be if this were a group of young white men beating the living hell out of a black man, and then the black man's girlfriend had come up and confronted the white men, and one of them had cold-cocked her and knocked her to the ground so that she was lying on the ground bleeding profusely. This would be a national news story. Instead, it is a local news story with literally zero national news coverage. If you search for more information on it, it is almost impossible to find. Cincinnati police chief sent a statement about the incident. It's only been covered very briefly by WKRC in Cincinnati. Well, police said they were investigating a large fight that occurred on 4th Street Friday night. Video circulating on social media depicts a man being punched by multiple people and falling to the ground, where he is then repeatedly kicked. A woman is also seen being attacked and knocked to the ground. Authorities are working to gather more information about the incident. The Cincinnati police chief sent a statement, quote, "I am in complete disgust waking up to the viral video many of you have now seen. The behavior displayed is nothing short of cruel and absolutely unacceptable. Our investigative team is working diligently to identify every individual involved in causing harm. It's also important to clarify this is a sudden dispute between individuals following a verbal altercation. It was not connected in any way to the music fest." Okay, that's all fine and dandy. The real story here, of course, is not the actual incident, which, of course, should be news. And we should have more information on what exactly happened here. The real story is the dramatic lack of news coverage. And it just demonstrates, as we've been discussing, the death of the legacy media is self-inflicted. It is a suicide. Their inability to cover in any level of equality racial incidents, regardless, by the way, of the prevalence of the racial incidents, because it is significantly more common for a black person to assault a white person per capita than for a white person to assault a black person. Now, again, as I mentioned, with regard to these specific statistics, it's also way more common for a black person to assault a black person and a white person to assault a white person. And not every cross-racial incident is about the race. But for a media that always makes it about the race, when it's white on black, when it's black on white, to completely ignore it, it just demonstrates why the credibility of the media is absolutely in the toilet. And again, there is, I'm looking at it right now. There is literally no media coverage of this in the national media, none. And we know that it would be precisely the opposite if the races were reversed. The hatred that Americans have for institutions, a hatred that, again, in some ways is salutary because it means that we are more skeptical of the narratives being retailed. And in some ways, incredibly dangerous because if you're not skeptical of other narratives, then you end up buying into a bunch of BS. All of that is earned by the legacy media. They've earned all of it. They've earned all of it. Alrighty, folks, the show is continuing for our members. Right now, we'll jump into the mailbag and answer some of your questions. Remember, in order to watch, you have to be a member. If you're not a member, become a member. Use code Shapiro. Check out for 2 months free on all annual plans. Click that link in the description and join us.